Hello friends, welcome to a new series that I'm doing. I'm going to be reviewing more supplements, not supplement brands individually, but just supplements in general and telling you my opinions of their value, mostly from research reviews. So for every one of these videos, including this one, you'll find a blog post linked down below in which you'll find all the citations that I take from in what I'm talking to you today. It's going to save me a lot of time instead of putting the citations on the videos. Basically what I'll do is for each citation, I'll just write a bullet point saying what I mentioned in the video that you can take from that paper. So you can open the paper and read it yourself. And by the way, if you guys just see the citations, all you have to do is go to Google Scholar and paste the citation, which is an APA format, and you'll get the paper. So most of these videos, what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss supplements in general, but I decided to start with one that I'm extremely fond of. And today, actually, I probably titled this hormone replacement therapy because I don't replace my testosterone and I don't actually replace any of the sex hormones, but I do replace melatonin. And I've never talked about this before, I think, on the channel, but my clients know a lot about this because I ask most of them to try to do this as well. The way I learned about this personally was because of, obviously I used melatonin when I was younger. Most people do, sparingly, because we're scared to use it, because we don't want to mess up our natural body's circadian rhythms. Actually, if you look at the interviews of top sleep scientists or read their books, what you'll find is that most of them are also quite averse to using melatonin as a sleep aid. They're basically concerned that we don't produce much melatonin naturally, and they're concerned because they haven't seen long-term studies of what what exogenous supplementation with melatonin does to endogenous production of melatonin, as well as what it does to melatonin receptors, maybe down regulating those receptors because there's too much melatonin. So people are regularly taking 10 milligrams of melatonin, whereas the body produces less than 1 milligram, a very low amount actually. So what these sleep researchers will tell you to do is try not to take more than 3 milligrams, knowing that the bioavailability of melatonin orally consumed is about 15%. Now, I have a different view because a lot of what I do is spend time researching how to improve brain function. And the reason why, as you guys know, is because I'm very interested in living the best life I can. And the way I see it is the brain is our soul. So if your brain can be in its best state, you'll most likely be your happiest and be able to function your best in life. And to me, the brain is more important than our cosmetic looks and than our physical performance in sports or anything else. And we don't pay enough attention to it, in my opinion. And so that's why I read a lot about it. And a lot of the studies that I read about the brain are about neurodegenerative disease because the most interesting research being done on the brain tends to be on molecules, especially pharmacologically, tends to be on molecules that are used to improve the lives of people with Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or prevent the progression of the diseases. And these molecules are interesting because in both of these diseases, these people suffer from anxiety and depression. But in all people, okay, I'm going a little off topic, but all people lose neurons as they age, especially after the age of around 25. And all neurodegenerative diseases the main effects of them come from neuronal loss, which comes from damage in the brain due to different pathologies. So, one of the things I came across when I was doing this is a lot of research, particularly in Alzheimer's disease, on melatonin. And I was originally quite confused. I found a lot of studies talking about using 100 milligrams of melatonin for Alzheimer's disease. I found studies combining the shape of the melatonin molecule with acetylcholinesterase inhibitors like donepezil, which are currently used to improve cognition in Alzheimer's disease. I found a great deal of these things and I wondered why. And what I realized quite quickly is that melatonin is an extremely powerful scavenger of free radicals, meaning it deals with reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species very well. Now, it's not the most powerful scavenger of free radicals that we can take, but what's interesting about it is metabolized in the body into various other metabolites, which are independently powerful as scavengers of free radicals, and they affect different kinds of free radicals in different ways. Not only that, but melatonin readily passes the blood-brain barrier, meaning it's one of the only antioxidants and anti-nitrogen species. I forgot the word for anti-nitrogen species. There's a word for it too, like antioxidant. But it's one of the only ones that we know will pass the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain, protecting your brain from the damage that comes from oxidative stress and so on, which is a hallmark of the aging brain. So, in that sense, melatonin is very interesting. That's what attracted me to using it consistently, despite my extreme interest in circadian rhythms and my concern over that. And in this video, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to introduce you to melatonin a little bit. I have some notes here, and I'm going to tell you essentially what it can do for you, why it can do what it can do, and how I would think about approaching using it as a replacement therapy, on a daily basis in the long term. So, first of all, melatonin was discovered, it was isolated from cows in 1958 by a guy called Aaron Lerner. It is a very, very, very ancient molecule. What that means is it's found in all kinds of species of living organisms. It's found in fungi, it's found in plants, it's found in invertebrates and vertebrates. It's everywhere, which means it's extremely ancient, and our bodies are, have been producing it since way before we were humans. Now, melatonin has activities in terms of its pharmacodynamics. It has activities at two dedicated receptors. One is called the melatonin 1 receptor, MT1, I'll tell you about that in a second. One is the MT1 receptor and one's the MT2 receptor. Some species also have an MT3 receptor. We don't have one that's working. Now, the circadian rhythms of the body are governed by something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, which is shortened, I'll call it the SCN. So the SCN is what you can imagine as the master clock. It sets the rhythm for all of the body's peripheral clocks. You have a peripheral clock in your pancreas, you have one in your liver, you have clocks everywhere in your body. They're all governed by the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus responds to melatonin. So if you agonize the MT1 receptor, what happens is the neurons of the SCN basically lower their firing rate. They stop firing as much. If you agonize the MT2 receptor, they experience a phase shift in their circadian rhythm, which means they fire later. Like whatever they were about to fire, they're gonna fire later if you agonize the MT2 receptor. But melatonin does much more than that, which maybe this is the time I should mention it. So, for people that have severe circadian rhythm disruptions, they have been developing some analogs of melatonin that agonize the MT1 and MT2 receptors, sometimes with more affinity or efficacy than melatonin, but do not have the other effects of melatonin, because melatonin doesn't just agonize these receptors. So, people have been developing these analogs or these ligands of the MT1 and MT2 receptors with the purpose of just affecting sleep, because melatonin does much more than that. It ends up governing a lot of the circadian rhythms of the body. And the way it does that is, number one, it's also the endogenous ligand of the retinoic A receptor, or retinoic acid receptor and the retinoid X receptor, which are RAR and RXR. Those are the receptors that respond to, for example, what are those medications called? Basically vitamin A related medications, retinol and retin A. Those are the same receptors that respond to it. We actually have an endogenous molecule that does that. That's melatonin. We produce it. It also agonizes or binds to a lot of other proteins and alters their behavior in the body. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but if you check out the article below, you'll see over 60 citations. I've handpicked them so that if someone's very interested, they can find some of the best papers on the subject, so you can get a really detailed introduction to the biology of melatonin in the body, which is very complex. Also, I've mentioned the antioxidant and anti-nitrogen species effect. Basically, the benefits of melatonin, of supplementing melatonin, you can think of it as in two ways. Number one, your natural melatonin synthesis in your body declines after the age of 25. As it declines, and other things change in your body also, over time your circadian rhythms, which means how your body's biology changes through the day, they flatten out. meaning your body starts to act like you're in nighttime during the day, and it starts to act like you're in daytime during the night. This becomes very pronounced when you get older, leading to a reduction in REM sleep, that's rapid eye movement or dream sleep, which has serious consequences for longevity and for other things. Also leads to less sleep at night, and it leads to weaker deep sleep, which is non-REM sleep, stages 3 and 4, or stage 3 if you have a different metric. And it also causes, it seems to cause a lot of dysfunction in the body in general. So when your circadian rhythms are off, for example, you become insulin resistant, you're more likely to become diabetic, you absorb your food worse, you partition it worse, you start to store visceral fat. It may be one of the main reasons that older people store more visceral fat, the circadian rhythms. So what you do when you supplement melatonin exogenously is you can maximize the amount of melatonin that your MT1 and MT2 receptors can get, as well as all of its other activities. So you can get to, just like replacing testosterone can get you functioning in some way sexually as if you're in your 20s, the same thing can happen with melatonin, where if you supplement it, you can start to have a circadian rhythm, at least both parts, because melatonin synthesis at night also affects your insulin sensitivity during the day. So basically you can hardwire your circadian rhythm to function a bit better. By the way, how do you hardwire it during the day? The way you do that is by exposing yourself to light, by doing exercise and moving, or by using a drug called SR9009 or SR9011, which will hardwire that, it'll force you to basically wake up during the day. So when you're older, maybe in your 60s, you might want to combine both of these so that you force your circadian rhythm to continue working as well as it can. But the point is, the first thing you can do by supplementing melatonin is force your body to function at its peak circadian rhythms. If you take it the right time of day, of course, you can't be taking melatonin during the daytime. Otherwise, you're going to flatten out it has to be taken at the right time of day. Usually melatonin starts being released about 2 to 3 hours before you go to bed, by the way. So most recommendations are to take the supplemental melatonin about 2 to 3 hours before you go to bed. However, that has issues also, and I'll get into that probably at the end of this discussion. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is why I'm particularly interested in it, is my circadian rhythms are actually really good and really stable because I do a lot of things to deal with it. And I used to, for example, use light blocking glasses a lot. I still use them, but to a lesser extent because I take so much melatonin. Which, by the way, the reason you take light blocking glasses is mainly because if you get blue light during the nighttime, it sends a signal to your brain to stop synthesizing melatonin. So you synthesize less melatonin. So say you're synthesizing less melatonin. You take a high dose of melatonin, like 10 milligrams a night. You get a replacement dose of melatonin as if you're in your 20s or more. Now, your receptors may downregulate, but they're only gonna downregulate to a certain equilibrium in the body. They're not just gonna keep going down. So if you go to a certain amount, you're getting the maximum saturation of melatonin's effects in the body. Is it possible that 10 milligrams or 20 milligrams of melatonin does something other than to the MT1 and MT2 receptors, for example, at the ROR or RXR receptors that a 20-year-old's melatonin does not do? It is possible. But I don't think it's that much of a concern myself. There's no studies indicating that it is. There's no evidence to show that there's something going on that we don't want to go on. But taking it during the daytime is obviously wrong. The other effect, which is what I'm interested in, is the free radical scavenging. That's very powerful. That happens at many levels of melatonin metabolism. And that happens in the brain because it goes into the brain very easily. So it may go into the brain, for example, at a higher level than what your body produces naturally, and maybe it saturates the MT1 and MT2 receptors, and there's no need for more melatonin. But the more melatonin you have, the more reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species and generally free radicals are being scavenged. Now in the body, there is a theory that if you scavenge too many free radicals, and this is why one of two reasons that I'm, for example, against injecting glutathione, but it's not the main reason, actually. The main reason is my concern that your body may synthesize less glutathione, which I think is dangerous because it's such an important free radical scavenger. But with melatonin, the thought may be that if you're scavenging too many free radicals, there will be less apoptosis in the body. And if there's less apoptosis, then you could have cells dividing that shouldn't be dividing. So that could be the concern. At the same time, of course, when you have more and more free radicals, you get DNA damage that causes the cells to get to a state where you don't want them dividing. So that's one thing. But with melatonin, what's different is we know that melatonin selectively causes apoptosis, which means cell death, in cancer cells, whether it doesn't do that to other cells. So it has a specific element that has to do with its unique metabolism, not to do with its reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen species stuff, that causes apoptosis in cancer cell lines. So it's not so much a concern there. So basically there's two reasons to take it. One is to get the circadian rhythms as close as you can to a 20-year-old, or really to like although the studies show synthesis of melatonin peaks around 18 to 22, something like that, but really probably most of you remember it being very high when you were 17 or 18. To try to get it to that level and get your circadian rhythms functioning as well as they can. And by the way, I'm going to talk about circadian rhythms in this video, but if you want to get a book on it, it's a really short book. It's a book called The Circadian Code by Sachin Panda. Sachin Panda is the leading researcher in circadian rhythms from the Salk Institute. He's really wonderful. The book is very readable. You don't need any scientific background to understand it. So I'm gonna discuss them a bit in this video. But the point is, when the circadian rhythms are functioning as well as you can, there's so many different biological effects. And the other reason you would want to take it is to reduce reactive species across the body and particularly in the brain. Especially at higher doses, this is very interesting. So I'm going to take you through a tour of the notes that you'll see in the blog post. Let's begin with the brain. First of all, melatonin has been tied to neurogenesis in the brain for a couple of reasons I mentioned directly in the blog post. I'm going to try to keep this a bit short so you can read the details in the blog post and check out the paper yourself. But it's been tied to the differentiation of neurites. Has been tied to GDNF and BDNF, which are glial cell-derived neurotrophic factor and brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's co-localized with them in the brain, which often means that it may affect their synthesis. It is being researched for the treatment of Parkinson's disease, ALS, which my grandmother died from and I'm quite concerned about, and is being researched extensively for Alzheimer's disease, as I mentioned before. Mainly due to this reduction of reactive species in the brain. Because, just to give you an example, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, you have what are called amyloid plaques, which develop in between cells. These amyloid plaques cause reactive species to exist in the brain, and they cause damage to neurons. Melatonin is neuroprotective and deals with these free radicals. The same exists for Parkinson's disease, although it's a slightly different kind of development of proteins in the brain. And with ALS, for example, it's really tied to having very high levels of reactive species in the body. So ALS seems to progress tremendously when people have more reactive species, higher C-reactive proteins from their liver and so on. Interestingly, melatonin has been shown to attenuate the damage from methamphetamine toxicity, which methamphetamine toxicity kills neurons in the brain. Specifically, well, I won't get into too much detail. It's been shown to do that for methamphetamine as well as ethanol and probably other drugs as well. And not just in the brain, of course, with ethanol, because ethanol affects the liver, and melatonin is very potent at reducing liver damage, which we'll talk about in a second, I think, in more detail. It's also thought to be potentially, supplemental melatonin is thought to be potentially likely to increase longevity. And it's been shown to do so in some small organisms. I don't know if it's been researched in rodents yet, but there are reasons for this. For example, it seems to reduce cell senescence. So in the body, cells have a certain number of times. This is one of the reasons I'm against growth hormone use, by the way. So cells in the body have only a certain number of times that they can divide. When they get to that nth division where they can't divide anymore, they either commit what's called cell apoptosis, which means programmed cell death, or they turn into what's called senescent cells, which are like zombie cells. These cells don't function fully, but they continue to release toxins in the body. Now, it's been shown in studies that when these senescent cells are removed, for example, from people's knees, they no longer get knee pain, the old people. They no longer get knee pain. And when rodents have treatments and there are, by the way, a lot of pharmacologic treatments for senescence being researched right now. It's one of the leading things being studied for reducing the effects of aging. It's been shown in rodents that when these treatments are given, the rodents don't die too much later, but they don't exhibit the old phenotype where they have difficulties walking, their fur gets worse, all this stuff. So a lot of stuff to do with the health span, to do with the way we feel when we're older, seems to deal with senescence. And melatonin reduces the cell's likelihood to turn senescent. It also increases the activity of sirtuins. So sirtuins are what are increased by, for example, resveratrol and NMN and nicotinamide riboside. So there are good reasons to think that it may have a longevity element as well, especially because we know we're synthesizing less melatonin as we age for sure. We're synthesizing less than when we're younger, and the only way to change that really is to replace it. Now, I'm going to talk to you guys now about some of the effects of hardwiring that circadian rhythm to function better over time as you age. And we're going to talk about some people with diseases like type 2 diabetes and stuff like that, but in general, this and people with hypertension, but in general, this may be the case for all people that are aging in general because they're producing less melatonin. So I'm just going to briefly take you through it. You can read the papers in the blog post, which is very readable. So first of all, let's talk about blood pressure. Melatonin significantly reduces systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Not that much, but it reduces it significantly, showing that it has an effect on improving the circadian rhythm, which in turn affects but also melatonin has a direct effect with the renin-angiotensin system. The renin-angiotensin system affects melatonin, and melatonin affects that as well. So it may have a direct effect also. Melatonin improves lipids in dyslipidemia. So the most consistent effect is that it lowers serum. By the way, everything I'm mentioning so far is significant, which means it's statistically significant. It's not, anything that was minor and that was not statistically significant, I did not include in the notes. So it reduces triglycerides, but that's the most significant effect. But some studies show reductions in HDL cholesterol, and some studies showed in total cholesterol that are not specific to LDL or HDL. Increases in HDL cholesterol. Some studies also show reductions in LDL cholesterol, but most significant is the triglyceride lowering effect. Melatonin is also immunomodulatory. So melatonin is synthesized by the parts of the immune system also. It's not just synthesized in the brain, I didn't mention. It's synthesized in several parts of the body. But also it governs the activities of the immune system. So one of the things it does is increase the activity of natural killer cells, which are cells that are surveillance cells for cancers. They're the cells we rely on significantly to detect and kill cancers. But it also improves the activity of, or reduces the activity of pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin 6, for example, and TNF alpha, tumor necrosis factor alpha. And it on the whole, across so many studies, reduces C-reactive protein, which C-reactive protein is a protein released by the liver when your body is in a high inflammatory state. So it's a proxy by which you can judge a high inflammatory state in the body. So seeing improvements in the C-reactive protein basically indicates that a person is in a less inflammatory state, which is key because there are so many diseases in life that get worse when you're in a pro-inflammatory state chronically. You should have some inflammation in the short term when you're dealing with something like a virus or a bacteria, or when you go into the sauna, but it shouldn't be a chronic inflammatory state. That's the concern. So also to talk about cancer, there is evidence that melatonin reduces the incidence of cancer in some way. There's not very controlled studies, but there's reasons to think it does. And there's a lot of reason to think melatonin reduces the ability of cancers to metastasize, which means to prevent, for example, liver cancer. So for example, liver cancer, hepatocellular carcinoma, is very deadly actually. But the reason it's deadly is because it spreads so quickly in the body. So the spreading is called metastasizing. So breast cancers that don't metastasize are quite treatable, but when they metastasize, it becomes a bigger issue. So melatonin seems to be particularly good at preventing that from happening. It causes apoptosis selectively in cancer cell lines. It also inhibits angiogenesis in cancers, angiogenesis is the creation of new blood vessels, which many cancers rely on to grow. Which usually happens through something called VEGF, which is a vascular endothelial growth factor. So it inhibits this in cancer cell lines. Also, it's thought that the reason that night shift workers develop breast cancers more often is because they have less melatonin. So night shift workers, of course, develop less melatonin because they sleep during the daytime. So they get melatonin, well, they get melatonin at night while they're at work, probably a little bit, and then they get way less during the daytime. So it's thought that that may be the actual reason. Now, melatonin is very researched in terms of the metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is something that happens very frequently in America. It's marked by five things, five noticeable things like low HDL cholesterol, high visceral fat, hypertension, stuff like that. So it's been shown, number one, it's very well understood in terms of the pharmacodynamics of it, that melatonin causes insulin resistance when you take melatonin. So when you, for example, this is the reason why you partition food worse at night. Once your melatonin gets synthesized in your body, you start to immediately, for a variety of reasons, it has effects, for example, on GLUT4 expression, on lipolysis, on lipogenesis, on fatty acid uptake, on pancreatic islet function. It modulates IGF-1 activity. So there's a lot of reasons. But it directly causes insulin resistance, and it also causes insulin sensitivity during the daytime. So what's been studied is this. I'll give you some examples. For example, in diabetics, melatonin has been shown to improve HbA1c levels, minorly, by the way. Supplemental melatonin I'm talking about. Minorly, but it does significantly. It improves fasting blood glucose. It improves insulin sensitivity, as tested by the oral glucose tolerance test. It's also been shown to improve in these studies, blood pressure and lipids and C-reactive protein and measures of oxidative stress, including glutathione metrics and things like that. It's also been shown to improve weight loss among the obese. And in the obese, it's been shown to reduce the synthesis of adipokines, which are cytokines, inflammatory cytokines, or non-inflammatory cytokines that come out of fat cells. They're called adipokines. Leptin is one of them, for example. So it reduces the synthesis of those in the body, the expression of them, and it reduces C-reactive protein levels in the obese. And we're talking about specifically supplemental melatonin. There are different milligrams in each of the studies. I've mentioned most of them in the notes that you can find on the website. Melatonin also has been shown to improve the liver grade quality in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is a very common disease in the US. It also improves C-reactive protein levels, which means lowers them in people that have NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So that's basically an overview of things that melatonin does via its modulation of the circadian rhythms. Now let's talk about dosing. So I want to mention this briefly because it's quite interesting and important. First of all, let me mention that there are studies with higher doses of melatonin. So the highest dose I've found is 300 milligrams of melatonin taken, I don't know what they call it. Basically, rectally. It's taken rectally. Basically, they put like some rectal suppository in the rectum of people with 300 milligrams of melatonin. So this is absorbed way more strongly than taking it orally. It was given to patients with ALS who have, of course, very inflammatory states because of reactive oxygen species, and it completely normalized the inflammatory environment in the ALS people. That's how powerful it was at a high dose. And it didn't have adverse consequences, at that dose. Now it's pretty interesting, by the way, because rectal, that's actually the only study I saw reviewing rectal suppositories. And generally it's known that rectal administration enters the bloodstream quite easily. So one would imagine that it would have the serum levels of melatonin would have an almost linear decrease over time, which is what is seen, by the way, in intravenous melatonin supplementation, which has been done, by the way, because melatonin is very poorly orally absorbed. About 15% of it is absorbed. Most of it's removed in the first pass from the liver, which is not so bad, by the way. Just getting it in the liver probably causes it to remove reactive species in the liver. Even the first pass ones that is actually removed probably have an effect in the body. They go throughout the body anyway, and they still have an effect. Because it's not a prodrug, it's already melatonin, and it's already active. But so let me take you through this. So 50 milligrams of oral melatonin has been used in Parkinson's patients also with no adverse effects whatsoever. And these two studies, as well as the studies which I haven't actually cited here, but the studies on Alzheimer's patients, are what made me brave enough to start using more than 10 milligrams myself. I'm currently at around 60 milligrams, and I'm planning to continue raising the dose slowly as I figure out how much I should be using exactly of which kind. So this is where it gets interesting. Basically, the problem with oral melatonin is that the half-life is of not the timed release of the normal one. The half-life is about an hour, a little bit less than an hour. And peak concentrations are at about 40 minutes. So you get a really strong peak concentration. Now, I don't know if I'll include the graphs, but you can check out the citations there to see the graphs. Basically what happens is you take the melatonin. So normally in your body, melatonin is like released slowly. I mean, it's going to be hard to show you, but imagine, this way. Imagine the graphs like this. Usually melatonin is released 2 hours before you go to bed, and it slowly declines for the next 6 hours or so. When you take oral melatonin, it goes up very fast, and then it declines very suddenly for the next hour or so, and then it slowly declines and stays above baseline, above the natural level. If it's like 6 milligrams or 10 milligrams, even 3 milligrams stays above the natural level for the next few hours. But what I've noticed and what other people have noticed is that I think it's because of the peak. Even though you have more melatonin than you have naturally, you have a likelihood of waking up. And in terms of reactive species, you can get what needs to be done within an hour anyway. So think of it this way. If you take an acute dose of the quickly digested, not timed release melatonin every night, whatever built up reactive species you have, if you take enough, you're going to deal with them in your brain and your body everywhere within about an hour and a half or so, and then it's done, basically. So you get like a reset every night in terms of reactive species. So other people go to bed, they still have reactive species, their antioxidants in their body are not dealing with it. You don't. If you take enough, you deal with all of it and you wake up fresh. But there's also another way to think of it, is that you want a longer, first of all, you want to stay asleep. That's one thing. Number one, you want to stay asleep. Maybe number two, you want enhanced circadian rhythm, because it's still going to be enhanced if you take a high enough dose hours later, I guess. But maybe you want more even of the circadian rhythm effect. Or you want a longer period with antioxidants and anti-nitrogen species in your body, dealing with those species for a longer time period. So you don't accrue any over the night. Now, you're very unlikely to accrue any during the night, to be honest with you. But for this reason, I've looked into extended release melatonin. I was using extended release melatonin myself for a while. What I found is when I first started taking 10 milligrams of extended release by itself before sleeping, I started taking it 2 hours or so before sleeping, I found that I was a little groggy the next day. So what this told me is there was still a higher amount of melatonin the next day than would be there naturally. So what I've started doing is eating even earlier than I used to, and taking the extended release melatonin a little bit earlier, so like 4 hours before I sleep, or 3 hours and a half before I sleep, something like that. At the same time, I think that my receptors have downregulated a little bit, so I no longer get the groggy effect in the morning, even though I'm taking much more than 10 milligrams now. But let me tell you about the pharmacokinetics of the timed release melatonin. First thing is it's apparently almost equally bioavailable, about 15%. The half-life is now not less than an hour, but about 3.5 to 4 hours. Which, as you can see, if you're only sleeping 7 hours, then it's still quite significant in your body when you wake up. But if you take it earlier and if you sleep later, which you will probably tend to sleep for a longer time period when you take the extended release, it probably ends up quite okay, especially if your receptors downregulate. But here's another reason to take the SR9009 when you wake up. The problem is, for people like me, my circadian rhythm is still, despite this, it's still very solid when I wake up, so I don't really need to take it most of the time. But I'm interested in taking it. I will definitely start taking it daily once I'm past maybe the age of 40 or 45, because then the diurnal, which means during the daytime rhythm, is really off. Even though melatonin could probably improve the diurnal rhythm also. Anyway, you could, if you still feel sleepy during the daytime, you could do that also. But the point is, the half-life is much longer. It's about 4 hours. The maximum serum concentrations happen between, depending on the person, between an hour afterwards to 3 hours afterwards. So it's in the very fast metabolizer, it's almost the same time as the average of the non-extended release. But for other people, it's about 3 hours. So it depends on the function of your CYP of your CYP enzymes, which are the P450 enzymes, which specifically, by the way, it's metabolized by the CYP1A1 and the CYP1A2, as well as potentially by the CYP-C19, though this is not completely clear. By the way, 60% of the extended release melatonin was shown to bind to proteins, including HDL particles. And, you know, I mentioned this already, but there are analogs of melatonin that agonize the MT1 and MT2 receptors more than melatonin. I've included here at the end of the blog the actual affinity of melatonin for each of the receptors, though I'm not sure it's useful for the audience. Finally, I wanted to mention, so intravenous, high-dose intravenous melatonin has been studied. So unlike the other melatonin, it doesn't just rise and then decline and then sort of slowly decline and stay above baseline, but the intravenous one declines sort of linearly through the night. So both are very unnatural. But anyway, I don't think anyone's going to use the intravenous one, but there's certainly reason to want to use that because it will stay elevated for a longer amount of time. But I mean, it's not worth it. I don't think there's any reason to inject yourself like that. But just so you know, low-dose intranasal melatonin has been studied. Several studies exist on that. Transdermal melatonin has been studied. Oral transmucosal melatonin, which means sort of keeping it, for example, sublingually or even snorting it or something like that. It's much better, more bioavailable than taking it orally. I'm not too concerned about that. The reason is, as I said before, even if most of it gets removed from the first pass from the liver, the melatonin is still going to other places, like for example the bladder, where it still acts against reactive nitrogen species and reactive oxygen species. So it's still preserving the functions of the body wherever it's going. So I don't mind it going through that, especially because I have other supplements or other drugs that may be harming the body in other places, and the melatonin is going in the same places and reducing some of those reactive species. So I'm not too worried about it myself. I think that covers almost everything. One thing to mention though. Melatonin reduces the sex hormone, basically it reduces gonadotropin releasing hormone being released from the hypothalamus, being sent to the pituitary. In turn, there's less luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone from the pituitary being sent to the gonads. So basically this means that in your circadian rhythm, naturally, you're supposed to synthesize less testosterone or other hormones like progesterone from your gonads during the nighttime. If you go and take melatonin twice a day, then you're going to synthesize less gonadotropin or less testosterone and progesterone and everything during the daytime also. So of course don't do that, but nobody would, that's obviously not something you should do. Also, there's a theory that people who take melatonin and it quickly becomes ineffective for them are actually slow metabolizers. There's about 12 to 14% of people that have polymorphisms at the CYP1A2 enzyme. People like that are slow metabolizers. And then what they're thinking happens is that those people have higher amounts of melatonin throughout the night, so the receptors downregulate because they're not metabolizing it as quickly. So basically, those are my notes on melatonin. I know this may be a little bit dry. I was trying to make these videos more interesting. I think the other supplement videos will be more interesting, but basically, melatonin is probably my... people often ask me, like, well, what are the antioxidants or anti-nitrogen species that you're most fond of? And there are many that I'm fond of. I usually mention my hormetic shake, which is basically sulforaphane from broccoli sprouts combined with moringa powder. And moringa powder and sulforaphane are very powerful. But the way they work, it seems to be, is as hormetic stressors, things that have a biphasic effect. So when you take a little bit of it, it causes your body is used to sensing these kind of plant phytochemicals. And noticing that it has this phytochemical, it does this with, your body does this, for example, with turmeric also, or with coca also. It reacts in a way that is net positive for the body. So it does certain things like synthesize glutathione or do other things to deal with that signal from the plant, which is great. But this is a technical, traditional antioxidant. It's not about your body, it does, of course, affect, it's a hormone, it changes your body's function, improves the circadian rhythm and all that, and has therefore effects on dyslipidemia, on blood pressure, on insulin resistance, on diabetes, on cancer, really a lot of effects on cancer. But it also is a traditional free radical scavenger, a very powerful one, and one that scavenges free radicals throughout all of its metabolism. So it turns into many metabolites. Most of them also scavenge free radicals in different kinds of ways. And more important than that, it travels into the brain very readily. So it can really help to preserve brain function. I mean, that's what I think, obviously. There's no longitudinal studies on this, but I really think so myself. And usually I tend not to do things that are very risky, but I've been taking now for a while about 50 milligrams of melatonin. I take a combination actually of extended release and short release. Mostly extended release that I start a bit earlier, but I also take short release to actually make me fall asleep, because it seems that the sudden rise in melatonin helps me fall asleep. And if I ever wake up during the night, anyway guys, I was just finishing the video and I had like, I guess 20 seconds left, but the battery finished, so I had to change the battery. Anyway, the point is, I take a combination of short release and long release melatonin. I think it's great. Sometimes I wake up during the night, that's what I was saying. Sometimes I wake up during the night and I take an extra short release one. It's been working great for me. I actually feel really different taking the very high doses of melatonin, which shows me how powerful the free radical scavenging is, because I take a lot of free radical scavengers or hormetic stressors and I still feel a significant impact. So I really think it's great. I think it's the main hormone that most people should be replacing and that aren't. And I disagree with the sleep researchers, who I think most of them are not very familiar with, I mean, they do research the brain obviously, but they're not very familiar with the really strong potential of melatonin to scavenge free radicals, particularly in the brain. So they don't realize that even if your body is reacting to the melatonin, synthesizing less or whatever, first of all, we're not going to run out of melatonin. It's pretty cheap, it's easy to get, you can have it. It's not like, I mean, testosterone potentially could be harder to get your hands on than melatonin. And if you take testosterone for long enough, you really affect your natural ability to synthesize it. But melatonin is easy to get, and melatonin has way more positives going for it than testosterone. So I'm very fond of melatonin. I highly recommend you try it. I'm not a doctor, of course, so this is not medical advice, but non-medically, as a friend, I think you should try it. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time. Next week we'll have another supplement. I haven't thought of which one I should review yet. I'm thinking of garlic, because garlic's one of my favorite supplements. But if you have a request, post it down below and I'll check it out. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.